A lot of people on the right are challenging you, and they're saying like, oh, you're Soros affiliated. And people are saying, be careful, James O'Keefe, of this guy. He's secretly a Democrat. What say you?
Because they're worried about me. So first they ignored me. Now they say, okay, this
Right.
guy might actually just come out.
They want to know you. I think
Exactly.
people, just like with me, they want to know what's in your heart, what's in your
And
soul.
if I'm naturally a contrarian, there's a part of me that if the pack is running in that direction, I'm going to go in this direction. Just think through some of those positions. Lay off 75% of the employees in the federal government. Do you think that makes it easier or harder for me to secure donations from people who are in my own prior network?
What made you that way? What is it about you? I think maybe that's what people want to know.
Yeah.
What is it about you, deep inside, that drives you to do those things that other people don't do? Vivek, great to be with you.
It's good to be with you.
I know that you interviewed me, and now I'm interviewing you. So
Yeah.
I'll be asking you hopefully I ask you questions that people haven't asked you, so we'll see. This question comes from one of my close advisors who came up with this question. I hope I'm wording it right.
Okay.
I hope it's a tough question. What is it that you do not know right now that you will find out that you need to know once in the White House?
Well, by definition, I'm not going to be able to give you what the answer to that question is because I don't know it, but I'm sure it exists. And I think that approaching this role with humility is important. Let me give it some thought and think about what might fit that description.
Yeah, that's as we talk, maybe,
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing like off the bat, I think is a lot of foreign policy, I think, comes not just from textbook study, which I've done, and as an observer and talking to advisors. I do think some of it relates to actually knowing the human being on the other side. It's amazing how much of history and even war and peace and diplomacy is governed not just by the things you would draw up on a sheet of paper, but on knowing somebody because you sit across the table from them and what your dynamic and your chemistry is. And frankly, you and I didn't know each other at all before you came here today. And having spent some time together, I feel like my knowledge of you and our dynamic is very different than what I might have expected it to be in a good way today, but in foreign policy context, it might be not in a good way in other settings. And so one thing I could tell you that I definitely don't know, that I will need to know, and I can only know by actually having that same experience, is building that relationship with other world leaders, both those in our allies, but also leaders of those who we might consider our adversaries. And I think that's going to be a key element of doing the job well, and it's knowledge that by definition I don't have today. But I think I approach the role with the humility of knowing that I still need to have that input in order to do a good job.
Oh, another person said that you and DeSantis are probably some of the smarter people they've ever seen run for president. I'm going in a random order here, but I read your book, Woke Inc. I spent a lot of time on that book.
Thank you.
And I skimmed through the others, but just random aside, at Harvard, you was it slam poetry or rapping or?
Yeah, they would have like open mic nights, spoken word.
Spoken word.
Yeah, rap. I mean, it was
How
fluid.
did you get into that?
I mean, they would just do it in a dining hall on a given night. You'd show up. I kind of got into it a little bit.
It wasn't like
They
a
had some
club
competitions.
or?
I don't think there was like a formal club, not certainly that I was a part of. They would just have open mic nights, and people who were drawn to that kind of thing would show up.
And you were drawn to that kind of thing?
I was,
And
actually.
what about you made you drawn to that? Usually politicians don't rap or do poetry.
Yeah, I wasn't a politician back then. I was actually, for much of college, pretty science-focused. I spent a lot of my time in the lab. I was a biology major. I ended up going into the world of biotech after. So I think I sought out in my free time things that were really different from where my academic focus was. And so I was into, the Harvard Political Union. Actually, one year I chaired it. It was debate. I was sort of in a moderating role, a listening role, not one side or the other, which was a really interesting vantage point. And then, I was drawn to some of the spoken word stuff. I was drawn to a lot of other extracurricular activities that were far away from the sciences.
People that are, I would say Republicans, because I'm not much of a right winger, even though they claim that I am, and I don't know if you are. We'll get to that, but usually these sorts of people don't do artistic things, like they're like creative. The creative, it's a rather unusual to see someone rapping on the stage, and it's caused a lot of headlines, and Eminem's now contacting it. But just what about you? Is it just because you were drawn to do something different?
Yeah, I'd have to think about that. I mean, reflecting on, being yourself was one thing. Reflecting on why you're yourself is a very different question.
Everyone always asks me those questions, so now I'm asking you those questions.
Yeah, and I don't know if you would agree with me that those are the ones that take the most introspection. I think that, so look, I did play the piano growing up. I've had sort of an artistic bent for some of my upbringing. I think I've probably always been somebody who resists structure a little bit, actually. I find labels very confining. It's part of the reason, even to jump to your later question you mentioned, I don't really embrace the label Republican. Yes, I tend to vote Republican, but that's for reasons that have nothing to do with the partisan structure. What racial background are you? I kind of cringe a little bit at being reduced to the genetic attributes you inherit on the day you're born, even though I celebrate the cultural tradition that my parents came to this country from. Yes, there's positives there, but viewing yourself as reduced to any identity, a political identity, an ethnic identity, even your college major for that matter, is always something that I didn't do particularly well with. And
is that something the left and right both do equally, or the Republicans?
I'd have to think about whether they do it equally, but both definitely do it. I think it's just part of human nature. It's part of society and social structure. Is we as human beings, I think, are wired to want to have some type of framework where you can analogize things to. And I don't like to analogize. I like to analyze. And I like to ask what's true in the present now, rather than taking some sort of pre-existing structure and superimposing it on the person I'm talking to.
You say you play the piano. Do you still do that?
From time to time, yeah.
And what are your hobbies outside of, you're a very busy man running for office, you ran a company. Like, right now, what are your hobbies?
Right now, it's very difficult to have hobbies, but I try. I still play tennis. I'm an avid, I played this morning. I got 45 minutes in this morning. I'm an avid competitive tennis player. We're raising our two sons, and so now they were there with me, so we give them a chance to play too. So our hobbies are enjoyed through the prism of introducing our kids to new experiences. But I do try to sneak in a little bit for myself in there once in a while. Tennis is probably at the top of the list.
You've written, we talked about this earlier, a good barometer for health in any democracy is the percentage of people who say what they actually believe in public.
Yes.
And I'm an undercover person. I try to expose what they say in private to make it public. And you wrote a Wall Street Journal column with your law professor. I don't remember what year it was, but companies are legally bound by the First Amendment, referencing Wall Street Journal and Facebook about censoring conservatives. And you wrote that it created such a backlash that two of your advisors at your then company, the name of the company was Roivant, were backlash that a close friend of yours, even I think you mentioned, don't ruin it for these people. They were so upset that you wrote this article, and I was reading that, and we all know what that's like in society, that this sort of cancel culture. But what that particular experience that you went through, you wrote this comment. It wasn't a particularly controversial thing you were saying. You say people should have a First Amendment right on Facebook and Twitter, but it caused such consternation with people close to you. What is that psychology that would cause people to do that?
It was a particularly fraught moment in the country. So this was in the days after January 6, 2021, that my former law professor and I wrote an op-ed, which made an argument that's actually accepted as mainstream today, but it was described as a conspiracy theory and a kook legal theory at the time, which was that if the government pressures a private company to do something that the government could not do directly, like censor speech that's politically protected, then the action of that private company is still bound by the same constraint as the federal government. That includes the First Amendment. And so we went through case law, and it was interesting. It was pretty academic. There were these railroads back in the day that wanted, during the war on drugs, what the government wanted was to search and seize past drugs from passengers, but the government couldn't do it directly. So they told the railroads that, you know what, we will give you a special form of immunity, such that if you as the railroad, the private company, search your passengers, your employees, they can't sue you for doing it. We, the federal government, will give you that, but we're not doing it directly. The Supreme Court said not so fast. That's still state action in disguise. The Fourth Amendment still applies. So, there was this argument. There's a bookstore owner that wanted to sell a book. The prosecutor.
This is not a outrageous argument.
No, these are not outrageous arguments. These are historical arguments.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that what would cause these people, and this is something that I've experienced, people see in this country, why were they so upset about that?
Yeah, so I can't speak for them, but I can tell you what I think was going on and the psychology of it. And the reason I was going into the legal arguments is just to give you a sense for, this wasn't some sort of partisan attention-grabbing screed, okay? This was a legal argument drawing from relatively arcane Supreme Court precedents and cases. So what was going on in the country? I think that you're taught to believe that you're part of a tribe. And in that moment in our country, you were taught to believe that if the orange man is bad, then you're on the other tribe. And Donald Trump is, as they would say on the left, a threat to our democracy. If this is a guy who what he's saying is even remotely defensive, and what I said actually had nothing to do with Trump, but the way they read it was remotely defensive of what were unconscionable actions, then we're on the other team, and it's a tribal instinct that kicks in.
And these were two of your advisors.
Yeah, two people on an advisory board to the company. Yeah.
Was that revealing to you? Like you learned?
Very revealing.
I see. Yeah.
The thing it revealed to me is that sometimes you face choices. You're in situations where you just can't have it all. Okay, so my ideal vision of what I thought I was doing was, in my capacity as a biotech CEO, I was serving as a biotech CEO. In my day job, I didn't talk about politics at work. I didn't foist viewpoints onto my employees. Turns out most of the people who I worked with most closely, many of them had political views that were very different than my own. It didn't matter. We were developing medicines. But in my personal capacity, I had gone to law school. I had academic interests that were outside of the sciences. For me, I've always been a person, even dating back to my college days, that has diverse interests. In my personal capacity, with former law professors and legal scholars, I was offering my views as a citizen, not using the company to do it, not wearing my hat as a CEO to do it, but that's what I was doing separately. And in my vision, that worked, that we have different spheres of our lives where we can do these things. What I realized is that works if you have certain views in your capacity as a private citizen. But not if you have certain other views. And I happen to have some of the views that you couldn't hold in your personal capacity if you wanted to be the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company.
Do you think that's changed, though, now? Because even in my own experience, it was impossible for me to have a life outside of the alter ego that people established of me, James O'Keefe, Project Veritas. If I go on a sailboat for an hour, so is that now the case that you are completely embroiled with your corporate?
I think that well, a couple things have happened. I think one is ever so slightly for the better. I think the climate in the country is changing. I don't like to pat myself on the back, but as it relates to corporate America, I think I was a big driver in helping drive that change, not only through the books that I wrote, but then through starting another company called Strive that actually used shareholder capital to tell businesses, get the heck out of political agendas, focus on your products, so that the people in their personal capacities can still vote as citizens.
Let me ask you about this shareholder capitalism versus stakeholder capitalism. One of the things that struck me about what you wrote is that the long-term perspective versus short-sighted gains. As a columnist at Rutgers, which I was a newspaper columnist, I wrote about this, which is this idea of just short-sightedness. And is it Klaus Schwab that said companies do not have to stop pursuing profit for their shareholders, they just have to shift to a long-term perspective? I think that was Klaus Schwab who said that. And you got your start by licensing drugs from pharma companies that were, correct me if I have this right, far more financially better off, but succumb to short-term pressure to cut R&D. Is that correct? And these are billion-dollar companies. In a similar vein, I've always been wondering, like I'm a scrappy started with no money, and was able to do things that large billion-dollar ABC News, CNN refused to do or unwilling to do. Is there a analogy there in your world with these billion-dollar pharma companies not willing to do these things?
I think there's an analogy between your world and mine in that when you have corporate behemoths, what happened is somebody who's working in that hierarchy, they don't get personally the upside of taking a risk, like, say, a medicine that they should develop that other pharma companies don't want to. If that succeeds, they don't participate in the upside. But if they fail, they look bad. They might lose their job. They might get a budget cut. So they just sit on their hands and just do what everyone else does and follow the pack. That creates an opportunity, be it within a media company for people who behave that way or people in a pharma company who behave that way. That creates an opportunity for entrepreneurs to say, okay, I'm going to go in the other direction of what they leave behind, thinking for the long run rather than just on short-term annual budget cycles where you take that risk. Now, what's happened is the proponents of stakeholder capitalism, right? Those who want to say that we have to take climate change and racial injustice into account if you're running a business. What they said initially was that profit should not be the sole goal of a business, that a business should actually care about social agendas that governments weren't addressing, right? Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, used to say, businesses have to earn their social license to operate. If Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords, business leaders started to say, oh, we have to step up to address climate change instead. But then folks like me said, no, you can't do that as a business leader because that's not your role. You have a fiduciary duty to your shareholders. What they then started saying is, okay, never mind what we said before. We're just going to change our tack a little bit. What they started then saying is, oh, no, we're just looking after the long run interest of the firm. Right?
Using these social variables?
Yeah, to say that actually if you're going to be the CEO of a media company, or an oil company, or a biotech company, you still have to take climate change into account when making your business decisions because you're thinking about the long run.
Well, that seems like a
it's
possible
BS.
Fig leaf. I mean,
it's made up.
But even 20 years ago,
say.
I was wondering as a young cub reporter, how does Wall Street focus on long-term perspectives? What is your answer to that? Like, because most of these companies do seem to be loyal to the 30-year-old analyst every quarter.
Yeah.
So what type of company, forget this social climate change and Black Lives Matter, just pursuing the long term, how does a company do that? Is that the culture of the firm? Or
a big part of it's the culture of the firm, big part of the history of the firm, big part of it is having leaders. The person who leads the firm, a CEO who actually says, I'm committed to the long run without the short-term undulations. And then some of it has to do with the shareholder base. So I think the companies that are best able to think for the long run are the ones where the shareholders are actually investing their own money in the company. That might sound like a basic thing. Well, what do you mean? Invest their own money. Isn't that how it usually works? The answer is no, that's not how it usually works. Most shareholders of public companies in America are firms like BlackRock and State Street and Vanguard and so on that aren't investing their own money, their balance sheet money or their owner's money. They're investing other people's money through passive index funds and otherwise. So those shareholders actually tend not to be particularly focused on what really maximizes value and more focused on other fashionable social agendas that allow them to be more popular, maybe even raise more trendy capital during trendy cycles in our culture. And so to get academic about this for a second, back in business school, they used to refer to what was called the separation of ownership and control, to say that, the real problem is the CEO controls the firm, but the shareholders actually own it and they have divergent interests. And that was a problem back in the 1980s. It's where you saw the private equity industry and others born to address that. The real problem today is what I call the separation of ownership from ownership, where the people who show up as the shareholders of public companies in America, they're not the actual shareholders. It's not actually their money that's being invested. It's somebody else's money, what I call OPM, other people's money. That's the real problem.
So if the owners of the company are actual shareholders, they're more likely to pursue a long-term path.
Exactly. I'll give you an example.
To short-term.
Like Warren Buffett. I mean, we don't share
value
politics
investing,
but value investing. But at Berkshire Hathaway, he is the largest shareholder, and the other shareholders of Berkshire Hathaway, who include large shareholders, are individual shareholders in their own capacity, are able to take advantage of some of the short-term mislocations or dislocations in the market because other people are owned by firms that are investing other people's
You
money.
mentioned BlackRock. I get asked these questions all the time by people who don't pay too much attention to finance. And you mentioned in your book, too, that the banks might get something in exchange for agreeing to these government demands.
That's right.
And then I think you say in your book that we're not exactly sure what it is that they get, but they climate change, reducing carbon emissions, racial diversity goals, social justice. What is the consideration that these financial institutions are getting in exchange for these goodies that they're giving to the government people? Do we know?
Well, it's a good question, but I think that some of it shows up in the form of bailouts, right? In your hour of need. Do you get bailed out or not? This is an insurance policy, right? So you're kind of paying the insurance premium in the form of tithing to these environmental and social agendas. But when the bell tolls in a difficult time, like when you need a bailout from the government, that's when you actually get your payout. So that's how the 2008 financial crisis bailouts, I think, worked. That was in some ways an advance payment. It worked in reverse. I think the rise of the ESG movement really got supercharged in response. It was sort of the dowry, if you will, in the arranged marriage between big government and big banks. But I think it takes the form of those passive favors. Look who got to administer the COVID-19 stimulus packages, or the government money that flowed through financial institutions. A lot of that was administered by BlackRock. Interesting how that works. It's not just the US government. The Chinese government plays the same game, right? Look at BlackRock when they had to earn their right to be able to sell mutual funds in China. I'm not drawing a causal relationship, but you can judge the facts for yourself. Good Wall Street Journal reporting on this. Shortly before then, Xi Jinping or one of his deputies has a meeting with the likes of Larry Fink. They end up lobbying for lower listing standards on U.S. stock exchanges for Chinese companies. Shortly after that, they get an attaboy on the back by getting the license to sell mutual funds in China. So it's not that different. It's not just like the United States is the only country that does this. In some ways, it's an emulation of the Chinese model. You do favors for the government does favors for you.
Larry Fink walked a little bit of this ESG stuff back a month or two ago. I remember was that because there was a tidal wave of grassroots resentment about it, or did you see that? Or
Oh, absolutely. And
what caused that?
Well, I'm proud to have played some role in this. I think that I created, for example, a competitor, Strive, that was, a thorn in their side. Strive crossed $1 billion in assets under management a year after launching the first fund. It took JP Morgan 2 years to get to the same place after it got into the same line of business. But it wasn't that money per se. I mean, that's still a small amount compared to the amount BlackRock manages. But it was the fact of competitive pressure in the marketplace, clients then asking questions that clients weren't otherwise asking, that forces them to walk back a little bit. But they can't walk back all the way because pension funds like those in California, like CalPERS, or the state of New York's pension fund, what do? They actually tell these firms that you can't manage our money unless you adopt the goals of the Paris Climate Accords or sign the Climate Action 100+ network commitment or a wide range of other conditions. And so if you're one of these firms, BlackRock or Vanguard or State Street, think about it. A big fish is saying you don't get to manage their pension fund money unless you force your portfolio companies to do the same thing. So if you pull the string all the way up, it actually ends up being a political actor working through the back door of the market to do what the government couldn't do through the front door.
Public policy solution.
Well, I think some of the solutions aren't going to be public policy. They're going to be competition. So that's why I believe in partially solving problems through the market. I started a competitor. But there are public policy solutions too.
You look at I don't have the graphic, but I'll put it on the screen here. The owners of equity owners of Pfizer and Fox, and they're almost the top few are identical. It's BlackRock is I think 18 or 19%.
If you look at most public companies in America, that's the real problem. We were told we have competition between Apple and Microsoft, between Disney and Paramount Pictures, right? Between Coke and Pepsi. Turns out the top shareholders of these firms are almost universally the same set of ESG promoting asset managers. So a couple solutions I would say is, one is, let's just start with the easy stuff. The Biden administration changed the rules. They said that historically, the rules governing retirement funds say you had to maximize profit. Well, they said, now we're going to change that and say that's not the sole objective. They can take into account non-pecuniary benefits other than investment return. They didn't want to leave it to chance which one, so they even name it in the rules, such as climate change. So I would rescind a lot of those rules. So there is a lot of ways in which the government has helped create and fuel this problem. I'm going to address that as the next president. But there are also going to have to be entrepreneurs that step up and seize the opportunity to say that we're going to run the other direction when the pack runs in the consensus direction.
I believe that you are sincere in your desire to, I think you said you wanted to, was it dismantle the FBI, or what did you say about
Shut down the FBI.
Shut down.
Yeah.
I mean, as someone who's been raided by the FBI in an unconstitutional raid that it was the complete raping of the First Amendment, and I'm sure there are many other cases that are not as renowned as mine, but I mean, people call me naive. So is it naive for you to believe that you can accomplish these things just because of if for no other reason, the sheer, Leviathan that you're taking on, does that scare you? Does that intimidate you? And if not, why not? Because some would say that's naive.
So I don't think it's naive. I think it's grounded in an actual realist perspective of how the country is supposed to work. So the first thing is, when I say shut down the FBI, this is not a slogan. I've offered unprecedented detail on how we would actually do it.
Like in 30 seconds or less, how do you do that?
So 35,000 employees, 20,000 of them are back office, where a lot of the rot comes from. That's where the politicization comes from. All of them are going to have to find honest work in the private sector.
Which is that's the top people you said?
20,000.
20,000.
20,000 of the 35,000. Now, 15,000 are agents doing investigative work on the front lines. Move them to other agencies that haven't been corrupted in the same way, like the U.S. Marshals for child sex trafficking and other crimes, the DEA for taking on the fentanyl crisis or otherwise, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network at the U.S. Treasury. So this is very practical. 20,000 of the 35,000 fired, done, go home. 15,000 will reorganize to agencies that haven't been corrupted in the same way.
Let me.
Yeah.
Do you think that these agents or the rank and file, I don't know if rank and file is the correct terminology, are they just following orders? Are they Americans stuck in this job? What is your view on that?
I think a lot of them are individually good people, but the bad results they create are the product of a machine that is really bigger than just the sum of any individual part. And this is where I'm a little different than other Republicans who will compete and try to say with greater vigor than their competitor, fire Christopher Wray, not forgetting the James Comey game before, and the next James Comey will come after. It's not a problem of individual action when you're talking about the administrative state. It is the Leviathan. It is what Thomas Hobbes envisioned. It is a monster bigger than any individual. And I think the right answer is you can't just tinker around the edges of that monster, put a new figurehead on top. You have to slay the beast. And so that's what I'm bringing to the administrative state. The other piece that people say that's naive is, well, aren't there these civil service protections? That's what they told Trump, right? That's what stopped Trump. They said, you can't fire these people in the federal government. Well, read the actual law. Turns out that the civil service protections protect against individual employee firings. They do not apply to mass layoffs. Mass layoffs are absolutely what I'm bringing to D.C. There's a Reorganization Act from 1977 that says under limited circumstances, if it stimulates the economy or if it eliminates redundant agencies, then yes, the U.S. president is already granted power from Congress to actually shut down those agencies.
What do you think the greatest challenge or threat against you for doing this is? What will be the biggest obstacle? There are many obstacles, but what is the most terrifying obstacle to you?
Well, this is not the one that's most terrifying. The biggest one on paper, though, is that they're going to sue me, which I think is good.
The feds will sue you.
Yeah, well, the feds, even when I'm U.S. president, they're going to say, there's all this unconstitutional. The good news is I've studied the current Supreme Court, and they agree with me 6-3. It's sad that that's how we'll have to settle it. But the good news is that then codifies that into judicial precedent, such that the next president who comes after me doesn't have to deal with the same headache. What more terrifies me isn't the legal challenges. It's, I don't want to go there, but I think it's what history teaches you happens when there are people who challenge a system. But I'm a person of faith. I believe God put each of us here for a purpose. I believe if you're guided by that purpose, nothing's going to stop you. And, you stay true to your faith in a belief that the arc of history bends towards justice and that you actually are able to do what God put you here to do. But, I think that some ways, if you all believe that it's being done by me, then you live in fear. If it's being done through you, then I think for me that's the source of my freedom.
We could spend an hour on that point alone.
Yeah.
But And I agree with that. I mean, I mean, Tucker asked Trump about the question about assassination, and but I think choosing not to focus on fear. Again, I could spend an hour, but I want to ask you some more like semi-technical. And then I got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you about your upbringing and just some things, the anecdotes from your youth, administrative state, and then managerial class.
Yeah.
So I've actually experienced this in my own life, even in hiring, like just trying to run a company, like, of 80 people. Another thing I've seen in my life, high-paid bureaucrats who have no actual ownership in the company and balance the needs of the founder, investor, employees. You say these sorts of people are, quote, playing for power.
Yes.
Perhaps social stature. And I wanted you to comment on what you meant by that, because it's odd that a mid-level, I don't know, chief operations officer or what have you from some investment bank, not making a ton of money, but they're playing for power.
That's right.
What do you mean by that?
Well, so we've seen a shift in the balance of power in our country, not just in the government, including in the government, but not just the government, towards the middle managers. It's a horizontal managerial class. The same person who's the deputy undersecretary of God knows what in some three-letter agency is the same kind of person who becomes the associate dean of something at an elite university, that gets the ambassadorship to some second-rate country abroad, that also becomes the person who sits on the board of directors of some publicly traded bank. That is the horizontal managerial class that wields more power today than often the actual proprietors. On my own podcast, shortly before you and I chatted with, say, Papa John, right? John Schnatter, who's the founder of Papa John's. He's the proprietor, the entrepreneur, the visionary. But it's middle management or the board of directors or whatever that then eventually says that person's an inconvenience. We're going to toss them out when they pose a threat to actually wielding the power that the board wanted to wield. You've had your own experience of this even in the nonprofit sector. So we see it's what it is, the rise of this managerial monster in government. I mean, the person who we elect to run the executive branch, that's not the person who runs the executive branch. There's no sense in which Joe Biden's really wielding political power today. He's not. He's a puppet for the people who are in the three-letter agencies, not in the fancy buildings, right? The White House looks beautiful. Congress and the Capitol Hill looks like a beautiful place. But it's an illusion because that's not really where the laws are passed or where power is wielded. So that's what's going on in every institution in our country
it's getting
today.
more pervasive. And is it just a lack of integrity? How do you avoid that in a corporation? By just being more discerning in who you hire?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. I think first is actually takes leaders who have a spine, right? I think part of the problem is you have leaders who are spineless, who what the managerial class does is they make the life of the leader easier. To say, hey, you get to go home at 5 o'clock. You get your year-end bonus if you actually met your diversity, equity, inclusion hiring goals and your ESG goals. You get your 10% extra on your year-end bonus as determined by the board. Part of what you need are leaders to say, I would sooner lose those perks or even lose my job than to sacrifice my actual true duty, which is to advance the mission of this company.
The managerial class might accuse that leader of being a tyrant, but that's just hyperbole.
Oh, that's just a deflection.
That's always a deflection.
Of course it is.
And I've seen it many times.
It's a deflection.
But in many regards, the leader needs to be, maybe wrong word, but even more of a tyrant to prevent these managerial class
even
people
more
from,
true to the North Star of what the purpose of that organization
which they'll
was.
call tyranny, but
who cares what they call it?
It's the leadership
which
is more powerful.
What they call racist today is actually colorblind meritocracy, right? What they call, war is peace is the moment we live
Orwellian.
in right now. It's very Orwellian.
Is the administrative state or the managerial class, which is more powerful in the country?
Well, they're part and parcel of the same. See, James, that's what I would say is the administrative state is the example of the managerial class at work in the institution of government. Mm-hmm. In the institution of the university, it's the new managerial class of the associate deanships of God knows what. In the private sector, it's the professional boards of directors and middle management and the HR bureaucracies proliferating like a cancer through corporate America. So in different institutions, the managerial class presents itself in different ways. In the federal government, that's through the three-letter agencies and the deep state that resides within.
Going back to your, I guess it's not childhood, I guess it's post-college, I don't know, 2006, you talk about Goldman Sachs in your book, which has a very near and dear place in my heart for reasons I won't get into.
Okay.
Golden rule, quote, he who has the gold makes the rule. And
Interesting how that works.
You also mentioned people say, "Oh, I work for Goldman Sachs," like it's an impressive thing. But this was now almost 20 years ago. I almost feel like if someone says they work for Goldman Sachs, it might be used as a mark against them now.
Today, yeah, but
Do you
there's
think
new
that's-
versions of that. There's new versions
like
of
what?
it. Well, I think that for a while it was I work at Google. I'm an engineer at Google, right? And Google's engineering talent used to be really high, but it eventually came down. It was a money printing machine. It almost didn't matter who their engineers were. It could be the person with purple hair who walked in and added to the diversity quotas because they're part of a alphabet soup of new identities that helps them in their diversity rankings, but it still allows them to go home and say, hey, I'm an engineer at Google. Now that's actually fallen to one side too. So then it's going to be the new thing. I work in clean energy. That's probably what it is right now.
It always changes.
I work in clean tech. Yeah, whatever
changes.
it is right now.
It's
Changing.
the cachet of...
It's the cachet, yeah. But back in 2006, when I was a junior in college and got that internship, it was to say, I work at Goldman Sachs.
And,
right?
and you mentioned
that
an
was
anecdote
the
where
equivalent
they had
of it.
like a day to clean up the park or something in New York City, and your colleagues, and just briefly tell what you witnessed.
It's kind of a funny story. So, they say you take a day, they call it service day. Everybody shows up. You know what? They decide that nobody's actually doing service. Everybody's chit-chatting, office gossip, deal talk. The boss, the head of the group, is supposed to be there leading the way, nowhere to be found, shows up an hour late in his Gucci boots and says, hey, let's take some pictures and get out of here. Everybody laughs and leaves.
That's the sort of thing I would covertly record and do an investigation on. If
you would have actually had a field day with that.
Did that dishearten you? Did that make... How did that affect you?
I thought at the time it wasn't like I was like, oh my God, I'm so disillusioned. What happened? I wasn't that naive. You already see it. By that point, you're not surprised by it, right? It's sort of a combination of amusement and disappointment would be the way that I describe it. And also, I'm 21 years old. I'm not even 21 years old. I remember I turned 21 that August. I was like, that was interesting. In some ways, I guess it wasn't that interesting because that's unsurprising. This is exactly what I would have predicted. But still, when you see it hit you that starkly, you're like,
Well, Twitter didn't even yet exist in 2006. So I wonder if the machinations of people, they'd be a little more cautious to engage in that sort of behavior.
Yeah, I think so. But if you ask somebody else who worked at that type of Wall Street bank back in the mid to late 2000s, they would tell you that story wasn't surprising, right? People with different political views from mine, but who worked at Goldman even would say, yep, that sounds about right. And it's not surprising. And so it's the ennui of it, right? That's almost what makes it remarkable. Not that was such a remarkable story. So in a certain sense, like take your incident of that guy who worked at Pfizer that you caught on tape. This wasn't one of those incidents. Right? There was no bang at the end of it that really would go viral in the same way. It was almost, as they say, this is how it ends, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Yeah.
T.S. Eliot.
Yes.
So one of the
Wasteland stuff. That summer was the Wasteland, to borrow the name of the T.S. Eliot poem.
T.S. Eliot, this is the way the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper.
Yeah.
So a lot of people on the right are challenging you, and they're saying like, "Oh, you're Soros affiliated," and even I talked to some person I saw
I get
interviewing
this
you, and
all the time now.
I'm sure you probably.
Oh
I'm
my
trying to
goodness.
ask a different question than you've been asked, so I'm trying to word this differently.
Oh my God, I've been asked this one like about
I know,
500 times, but it's okay.
But let me
it's okay though.
in the couple minutes we have left, just answer this, and I'll probably ask you a follow-up. But like, people are saying, be careful, James O'Keefe, of this guy. He's secretly a Democrat. Okay, so what say you? What's leading people to believe that or say that?
So of course my first reaction is one to be just like defensive and say, no, here's all the reasons why you're wrong. It's very frustrating. There's an element of it that's frustrating. But just think about it for a second and then I get it. We have been lied to for a very long time by people who have been running for office to get something for themselves, or not even running for office, making an extra buck. And so I don't begrudge anyone anymore for earnest skepticism. I do begrudge some professional politicians and super PAC types that then use this to cynically exploit people. That bothers me more, and that does happen.
So there's people that are saying that about you might be being exploited by a super PAC. Or
exactly.
Okay.
So don't be exploited by anybody, is my view. Don't be exploited by mainstream media. Don't be exploited by right-wing media. Don't be exploited by some super PAC. Independently make your judgment. And then, yes, that requires everybody, including me, to be on the receiving end of some skepticism. Good.
What is the thing that they're
thing.
latching onto that would lead anyone to believe that you're a secret Democrat? Not that you are,
I mean, they're
what's the fact that they're latching on to?
So I could give you a bunch, right? and I think it's important that people understand this. The latest one over the last week is when I was 18, freshman at Harvard. Al Sharpton came to campus, and it was during the primary. And I said, well, why should I vote for you if you have the least experience? A little bit ironic now, but why should I vote for you because you have the least experience? But that presumed that I was going to vote in the Democratic primary. Gotcha. This guy's a Democrat. He's asking a question framed as though he's going to vote in the Democrat primary.
I see.
Two things I would say is, one is if there's an 18-year-old who did vote in the Democrat primary and then goes through his 20s and then his 30s and then has life experiences that lead him in a different direction, great. That person probably has more conviction than somebody who was just reciting their slogans. Now, it turns out that wasn't me. I was a guy who was already put off by what I saw, but I also didn't love George Bush, and I was against the Iraq War.
Is there a recording of this?
Yeah,
Okay,
there's a recording
there's
of
a
this,
video
right?
of it.
And so I ended up voting Libertarian that year, right? Because I was against the Iraq War. And so that was kind of not really a Republican position back then. But as I said, I don't care for these labels. There was a scholarship that I won back in 2010 by a guy who was related to George Soros. His last name is Soros. It was his brother who made his money independently, who's dead, by the way, that offers a generic scholarship, or they're one of the funders of a generic scholarship that at the age of 24, I unthinkingly accepted. $50,000, I'll take that. And that's what I took.
And when people on the road or whatever, I'm sure little old ladies bring this up to you. And
that's the Soros connection.
Are you able
to?
What is that interaction like? Or do you convince them, or are they begrudgingly skeptical, or what's?
Well, I think people earnestly show up. They don't know what to believe anymore, and I don't blame them. We're just constantly fed lies 360 degrees. I think when we're in a room and we can earnestly, and my job is I'm as transparent as I can be. I've put out 20 years of tax returns. I'm just doing things that no presidential candidate
You've done more
has.
interviews. You do every interview, which is highly unusual, but it's worked for you.
Agree, disagree, left, right.
How
criticism.
do you find the time to do that? Because I can't even do every interview, and I'm in the interview business. How do you do that?
I think it's your job. If you're running for U.S. president in this kind of era where people are constantly fed lies, the most important thing I can do is to take, actually the ones I turn down are the easy ones. I mean, the easy ones, we don't need those, right? That doesn't add to the discourse. But if somebody actually is going to hit me, right before here, I came off an interview. Unfortunately, it wasn't a very good one in the sense it wasn't conducted well, but it was by this MSNBC host who was screaming the whole time. But I'll still take it, right?
Were you screaming back? Or
I don't think so. I think we were trying to push him in a direction that was actually doing something productive for his
MSNBC
audience.
is what I read about your Soros connection right before I sat down with you. I guess it was an MSNBC article aimed to target conservative readers.
That's right.
And I mean, but the right
because they're worried about me. So first they ignored me. Now they say, okay, this
Right.
guy might actually just come out. And there's some articles on the left saying that now Vivek Ramaswamy is scarier than Trump, so they're trying to play the PSYOP game in reverse.
Well, the right finds conspiracies sometimes where they don't exist, but I don't.
And sometimes where they do.
Sometimes where they do, and most of the time, usually it's correct, but some of the times it's not. I would say 1% of my comments are like, he's controlled opposition. There's almost like this policing. There's this mechanism that wants to cleanse.
That's
and
right.
the right is not very cohesive. Conservatives are not cohesive.
They're not.
They're extremely competitive, very envious. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that. As someone who's ostensibly a conservative, maybe you are. I know labels are nothing, but
I mean, I in today's climate, I want to define what it means to be a conservative. And yes, I am a conservative, somebody who wants to conserve the values that made this country great and revive them. Sure, I'll take that label for the purposes of where we are.
But
right
the
now.
knives are out for you.
But the knives are out. But this is to be expected, right? Anytime there's something new, I mean, people might forget this. Remember, they said Trump was a Hillary plant. So you roll that back. And Trump went through his version of this, right? Why?
I think he gave money
because
to Hillary.
Because he had actually given
money to everybody.
But he gave money to everybody.
To us, too.
But he gave money to Hillary.
Yeah.
And so, look, there's going to be a natural process of skepticism. But the question is, to what end? Right? And skepticism good as long as you know to what end. If it's towards making sure that we're reviving this country and handing over the keys to the people who are best positioned to actually, with an earnest heart, revive this country, that's a good thing.
Well, they want to know you. I think
Exactly.
people, just like with me, they want to know what's in your heart, what's in your soul.
And if you're running for U.S. president, right, my job is everyone in this country, by the end of this process, should know who I am and what I stand for. And if after knowing that, they want to go with somebody else, I am deeply at peace with that. There's probably a part of me somewhere deep down inside that'll be relieved by that. we're living a great life. We've lived the full American dream. We have 2 young sons at home. My wife is one of the best in the world at what she does as a throat surgeon. She's passionate about it. Why are we doing this? It is our sense of duty. And one thing I would give people just a metric to just sort of think through the skepticism on is a good metric is, has somebody actually given up something, traded off something to advance their convictions? Right? Think about the things that I'm saying. People know how the Republican donor establishment works. I can read you countless text messages on this phone right now, but I don't need to read them to you because people already know this. Think about the things I'm saying about pardoning peaceful January 6th protesters. Think about the things that I'm saying about pardoning Donald Trump, about actually making sure that we expose the innards of government tech censorship, my position on ending the Ukraine war by doing a deal with Putin, my position that the climate change agenda is a hoax and that we have to end electric vehicle subsidies. Just think through some of those positions. Lay off 75% of the employees in the federal government. Do you think that makes it easier or harder for me to secure donations from people who are in my own prior network of multi-billionaires from Wall Street or elsewhere? Do you think that makes it easier? No. In fact, many of those people refuse to donate to me and are donating to my opponents, even the ones who know me.
And as of the time of this sitting, there was a conviction yesterday. Enrico Tario, I believe, got 22 years in prison. This is creating
which is unjust.
It's on. Was it a crime what he did? Or
well, I don't have. I'm going deep on the facts. It does have my eyebrows raised that a guy who wasn't present on January 6th, who his defense attorneys have at least said there wasn't an iota of evidence that he even told someone to do something violent, and is tried along with multiple other defendants, a practice that I don't love because it allows juries to get confused about which defendant actually did what. Doesn't smell good to me.
Right.
But I was the only presidential candidate who had the guts to say it. Nobody in the Republican donor class likes me talking about this stuff.
Is that because of their donors that will get upset about it?
Of course they get upset about it.
And that's usually the biggest variable.
And so I've taken tens of millions of dollars of my own family's 15, 16 plus million already of our hard-earned money and put it into this campaign when I could be raising even more mega donor money to do it. So just think about it. Does that sound like somebody who's, just, it's a fact. Make your own judgment. Take a look what I did. I was the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company. Took the trouble to expose government tech censorship and the legal arguments against it. Prominent advisors to my company resigned, putting me in a position where I had to make the decision that was the right one to step down. That's what I would say is just look at the decision somebody makes. I did not come out of the birth canal spouting Republican talking points. That's true. I explored ideas.
Your dad was liberal in your. You wrote about
he
that.
He leaned left, absolutely, and he also nearly lost his job and worked hard to do it. But just make your own judgments is all I would say to people. Think independently.
Maybe final question here is. And again, this is a psychological question, but I get asked this, so I'm going to ask you this, and you might punt the way that I do sometimes because I'm not a psychologist. But what made you that way? If what you're saying is true, and I take you at your word that you are indeed making a sacrifice. You're spending your fortune. You're doing things that are hard, that are sacrificial, that are not easy. What caused you? What is it about you? I think maybe that's what people want to know.
Yeah.
What is it about you, deep inside, that drives you to do those things that other people don't do?
Yeah. So there's the superficial part is I'm naturally a contrarian. That's the superficial part. It's almost the reactionary part. And it's not the most important part, but there's a part of me that if the pack is running in that direction, I'm going to go in this direction. But that's almost a teenage instinct. I think the deeper instinct is the world, this country, has almost been too good to me and my family, right? There's no sense in which I think we deserve to have drawn the hand that we did, being born in the country that I'm born in, at the time in that country's history when I was born in it, to the 2 parents who went all out to allow me and my brother to live the same opportunities, and then marry a wife who I was not only lucky enough to meet, but who herself was lucky to grow up in circumstances to have 2 parents that also allowed her to thrive in the way that she did. Now to have our 2 sons, to live the life we do after accumulating immense wealth by a young age. Yes, by working hard, but still a lot of people work hard and don't get there. It's almost a feeling like it is too good not to at least ask what we can do maximally to make that possible for people other than ourselves. And so, yes, we've donated I don't talk about it often, but like I tried the thing where you do it by being a philanthropist, donating and setting aside millions of dollars for charitable efforts that advance causes. For me, at least, that didn't give me the same sense of fulfillment and satisfaction. Right? The financial sacrifice is almost too easy to make. And so we're making some component of financial sacrifice in this campaign too, but that's not the big sacrifice. Putting yourself on the line, actually taking personal risk, like real personal risk. And I can tell you from experience over the last 6 months, even over the last year and a half since I started Strive is when it began. Yes, immense personal risk. I'm not asking anybody to feel sorry for us or anything else. But yes, for the last year and a half, in a meaningful sense, having taken real personal risk, it feels right. Right? That is going to be the minimum that I can do to live a life that was almost too kind, what this country had given us, not to be able to take some real risk to pass that forward. I think that's combined with my contrarian instincts and combine it with that sense of debt of obligation, put those things together, and the chemical reaction that resulted was this presidential campaign. And I think that's the best I could probably give you from a self-psychological assessment.
All right. I think that's a good place to end. Good luck.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it.